baby saw a bear cub hidden in a wedding chapel storage. What he did next united hearts. The morning light fell through the old chapel windows in long golden streams that seemed to carry the dust of decades past. Ethan Marshall stood near the altar, his fingers tracing the worn wood of the pews, while his wife Jessica Brooks cradled their 8-month-old son Leo in her arms. They had come to this forgotten chapel on the edge of town not for a wedding, but for something else entirely. Jessica's grandmother had been married here 60 years ago, and they wanted to feel the presence of that history, to let their baby breathe in the same air that had witnessed so many promises of forever. The chapel keeper had given them the keys and told them to take their time, that nobody else would be coming today. It was Tuesday, and Tuesdays were always quiet here, he had said with a knowing smile that seemed to hold secrets of its own. Leo was unusually alert that morning, his bright eyes following something neither parent could see. His tiny hands reached out toward the shadows in the corners of the chapel, grasping at air as if he could catch the memories floating there. Jessica kissed his forehead and whispered stories about her grandmother, about the white dress that had swept across these very floors, about the roses that had filled every corner. Ethan walked slowly along the side aisle, reading the names carved into the wooden beams by couples from generations past. Some dates went back to the 1800s, and he wondered about all those lives, all those loves that had begun in this sacred space. The chapel had that particular smell of old wood mixed with candle wax and something sweeter, perhaps the ghost of countless flower arrangements that had graced the altar over the years. As they explored, Leo began to make soft cooing sounds, not his usual baby talk, but something different, something that sounded almost like conversation. Jessica noticed it first, the way her son seemed to be responding to something, his head turning toward the back of the chapel, where a narrow door led to what the keeper had mentioned was just storage. That door had been painted over so many times that the layers of paint had formed ridges like tree rings, marking the passage of years. Ethan noticed Leo's fascination and walked over to the door, running his hand along its surface. The paint was cool to the touch, and underneath his fingers he could feel the grain of the wood, still alive somehow after all these years. He tried the handle, expecting it to be locked, but it turned easily in his hand with a soft click that echoed in the quiet chapel. The storage room beyond was larger than they had expected, filled with old wedding decorations from different eras. There were boxes of silk flowers that had lost most of their color, stacks of hymnals with pages yellowed by time, and in one corner a collection of wedding veils hanging like ghosts from wooden pegs. The light here was different, filtered through a small window covered in ivy, creating a green-tinted glow that made everything look as if it existed underwater. Leo's sounds grew more excited, and he stretched his arms toward the far corner of the room where shadows gathered thick and dark. Jessica followed his gaze, and that was when she saw it. At first, she thought it was a stuffed animal, perhaps left behind from some long-ago ceremony where children had been ring-bearers or flower girls. But then it moved, just slightly, a small shift that sent her heart into a different rhythm. The bear cub was no bigger than a medium-sized dog, its fur the color of chocolate mixed with honey. It sat perfectly still except for its eyes, which were watching them with an intelligence that seemed impossible for something so young. Jessica's first instinct should have been fear, should have been to grab Leo and run, but something about the moment held her in place. The cub wasn't threatening. It was simply there, as if it had been waiting for them, as if this meeting had been arranged by forces neither of them could understand. Ethan saw it too now, and he moved slowly to stand beside his wife and child, his protective instincts warring with an overwhelming sense of wonder. The cub tilted its head, mirroring Leo's movement, and the baby laughed, a pure sound that filled the storage room with unexpected joy. They stood there for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, locked in this strange tableau of human and wild, of civilization and nature meeting in the most unexpected place. The cub's breathing was visible in the soft rise and fall of its chest, and Jessica found herself matching that rhythm, as if they were all connected by invisible threads. She noticed details she would remember forever. The way the cub's ears twitched at Leo's sounds, the perfect pink of its nose, the way its paws were crossed almost politely in front of it. There was something about its presence that felt ancient and new at the same time, as if it carried wisdom beyond its apparent age. Ethan reached for his phone to take a picture, then stopped. Some moments, he realized, weren't meant to be captured. They were meant to be lived, to be absorbed into the soul where they could transform into something larger than mere memory. Leo made another sound, this one softer, almost like a lullaby, and the cub responded with a gentle huffing noise that sounded surprisingly like contentment. It was then that Jessica noticed the marking on the cub's ear, a distinctive pattern that looked almost like a star or perhaps a flower. She had seen that pattern before, she was certain, but couldn't place where. The thought nagged at her, even as she remained transfixed by the scene before her. The storage room had taken on a quality of sacred space, no less holy than the chapel itself. Here, in this forgotten corner, something extraordinary was happening. Something that defied explanation but didn't need one. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only this room, this moment, this impossible meeting that felt more real than anything she had experienced in years. Ethan finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, asking Jessica if she was seeing what he was seeing. She nodded, unable to form words, afraid that speaking might break whatever spell had been cast. The cub shifted slightly, uncrossing and recrossing its paws, and in that movement there was something so human, so deliberate, that it took their breath away. It wasn't just a wild animal that had wandered in by accident. There was purpose here, intention, though what that purpose might be remained hidden in the shadows of understanding. Leo reached out his tiny hand, fingers spread wide, and the cub leaned forward just slightly. Not enough to touch, but enough to acknowledge the gesture. It was a greeting, a recognition, a bridge built across species in the space of a heartbeat. The sound came from outside then, low and resonant, like thunder but not quite, like wind but something more. It rolled through the chapel and into the storage room, and the cub's ears perked up immediately. Its eyes, which had been focused entirely on Leo, now darted toward the small ivy-covered window. The sound came again, closer this time, and Jessica felt Ethan's hand find hers, their fingers interlacing in a grip that spoke of both fear and anticipation. The cub stood slowly, its movements fluid and graceful despite its youth. It looked back at them one more time, and in that look was something that felt like promise, like reassurance, like a secret shared between souls who had found each other in the most unlikely place. As the cub moved toward a gap in the wall they hadn't noticed before, a space between two boards that seemed impossibly narrow for even such a small creature, Jessica found her voice. She whispered a single word, "Wait," but the cub continued its journey, pausing only once to look back at Leo, who was now quiet, watching with those bright eyes that seemed to understand more than any baby should. The cub disappeared through the gap, and immediately the room felt different, emptier, but also charged with something electric, something that made the air itself seem alive. They could hear movement outside, not threatening, but purposeful, and Ethan moved to the small window, pushing aside the ivy to peer out. What he saw made him motion urgently for Jessica to come look. There, in the small clearing behind the chapel, stood a figure that made everything else make sense and no sense at all simultaneously. The mother bear was massive, her coat shimmering in the dappled sunlight that filtered through the trees. But it was her stillness that was most striking, the way she stood without aggression, without fear, simply waiting. The cub emerged from somewhere beneath the chapel's foundation and moved toward her with obvious joy. But the mother's eyes remained fixed on the window where Ethan and Jessica now stood together, Leo held between them. There was intelligence in those eyes, deep and ancient. And for a moment, just a moment, Jessica could have sworn the bear nodded. A gesture so subtle it might have been imagination, but felt like acknowledgement, like gratitude, like understanding. The mother and cub began to move away, not hurried, but purposeful, heading toward the tree line that marked the beginning of the deep woods. But before they disappeared, the mother stopped and turned back one more time. She stood there, magnificent and wild, yet somehow connected to them in this moment that transcended the usual boundaries between human and animal. Leo made one more sound, a happy gurgle that carried through the window, and the mother bear's ears twitched in response. Then she and her cub melted into the forest, becoming one with the shadows and leaves, leaving behind only the memory of their presence and questions that begged to be answered. Jessica and Ethan stood at the window long after the bears had gone, trying to process what had just happened. The rational part of their minds wanted to explain it away, to find logical reasons for a bear cub being in the chapel storage room, for the mother waiting so patiently outside. But the deeper part, the part that still believed in magic and wonder, knew that some things weren't meant to be explained. They were meant to be experienced, to be treasured, to be shared with those who would understand that the world was far more mysterious and connected than most people ever realized. Leo had fallen asleep in Jessica's arms, his tiny face peaceful, perhaps dreaming of his new friend, perhaps carrying memories that would surface years later in moments of need. They left the storage room but found themselves unable to leave the chapel just yet. There was more to discover. They felt it in their bones. Ethan walked to the front of the chapel where an old guest book sat on a dusty podium. He opened it carefully, the pages crackling with age, and began reading the entries from decades past. Most were what you would expect. Congratulations to newlyweds, blessings for their future. But then he found something that made his hands tremble. An entry from 1962, written in careful cursive, mentioned seeing a bear cub during the ceremony, how it had appeared at the window like a blessing, how the old-timers had whispered about the guardian spirits of the forest. Another entry, from 1988, described a similar encounter, a mother bear and cub seen at the edge of the woods during a sunset wedding, their presence feeling like approval from nature itself. Jessica joined him, reading over his shoulder, and together they discovered more entries, scattered across the years, all mentioning bears in connection with the chapel. Some were subtle, just mentions of feeling watched over by the forest, others more explicit, describing encounters that mirrored their own. The pattern that emerged was clear. The bears had been coming to this chapel for generations, drawn by something, connected to it in ways that defied conventional understanding. The marking Jessica had noticed on the cub's ear appeared in several descriptions, always described slightly differently but consistently enough to be the same pattern, passed down through generations of bears like a family crest. As they continued to explore the chapel, they found more evidence of this connection. In the small room behind the altar, where the minister would prepare for services, they discovered a collection of photographs yellowed with age. Many showed weddings, smiling couples from different eras, but in the background of several, if you looked carefully, you could see shapes in the forest, shadows that might have been bears, watching, witnessing, being part of the human celebrations in their own quiet way. One photograph, from what looked like the 1940s, showed a young girl in a flower girl dress standing at the edge of the woods, her hand extended toward something just out of frame, her face lit with the same wonder Leo had shown. The chapel keeper arrived then, an elderly man named Jacob Bennett, who moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned to respect both time and space. He didn't seem surprised to find them still there, nor did he seem surprised when Ethan began to tell him about their encounter. Jacob listened with a slight smile, nodding occasionally, his weathered hands folded in front of him. When Ethan finished, Jacob was quiet for a long moment, then began to speak in a voice that carried the weight of years and secrets. He told them that his family had been keeping this chapel for 4 generations, and in all that time, the bears had been part of its story. Not everyone saw them, he explained. Only those who came with open hearts, who weren't looking for anything but found everything. Jacob led them to a small room they hadn't noticed, hidden behind what looked like a solid wall but was actually a cleverly concealed door. Inside was a collection of journals, each one filled with accounts of bear sightings at the chapel, going back to its founding in 1847. The first entry, written by the chapel's founder, described choosing this location after following a mother bear and her cub through the forest, feeling called to build something sacred where they had led him. The stories that followed were remarkable in their consistency and their variety. Bears appearing during moments of joy and sorrow, always peaceful, always seeming to offer something indefinable but essential. Some entries described healing, both physical and emotional, that coincided with bear sightings. Others spoke of decisions made, paths chosen, lives changed after encountering the chapel's ursine visitors. As Jessica read, she began to understand that what they had experienced wasn't unique, but was part of something much larger. A tapestry of connections between human and wild that had been weaving itself for over a century. The bears weren't just random visitors. They were guardians, witnesses, perhaps even guides. The marking on the cub's ear appeared in drawings throughout the journals, sometimes called a star. Sometimes a flower, once memorably described as heaven's thumbprint. Each generation of bears seemed to carry this mark, at least one cub in every era bearing this sign of their connection to the chapel. Leo stirred in her arms, and she looked down to see him watching Jacob with those impossibly aware eyes, as if he too understood that they were being let into something sacred. Jacob told them about his own first encounter when he was 7 years old, helping his grandfather prepare the chapel for a Christmas service. He had been in the storage room, the same room where they had found the cub, when he heard breathing that wasn't his own. The cub he met that day had stayed with him for almost an hour, just sitting together in companionable silence, and that encounter had shaped his entire life. He had never married, never had children of his own, but he had devoted himself to keeping the chapel and its secrets, being a bridge between the human world and something wilder, older, more essential. He showed them his own journal, filled with decades of observations, patterns he had noticed, theories he had developed about why the bears came and what they meant. The sound from the woods came again, closer now, and Jacob smiled. He told them that on special days, days when the veil between worlds was thin, the whole family would come. Not just the mother and cub, but others, gathering at the forest edge like congregants at their own sacred service. He had seen as many as 12 bears at once, all peaceful, all simply present, sharing space with the human world without fear or aggression. These gatherings, he explained, usually preceded something important, some change or revelation that would ripple out from the chapel into the wider world. The fact that Ethan and Jessica had been chosen to witness the cub, that Leo had been part of this encounter, suggested that something significant was beginning. They walked outside together, moving slowly as if in a dream, and there, at the forest edge, just as Jacob had predicted, they waited. Not just the mother and cub they had seen earlier, but others. A massive male bear, his coat silver with age, sat like a patriarch overseeing his family. Two younger bears, perhaps yearlings, played at the edge of the clearing, their movements full of joy and energy. And there, in the center, the mother and cub from earlier, both watching the humans with those intelligent eyes that seemed to see not just who they were, but who they could become. Leo was fully awake now, his small voice joining what felt like a conversation beyond words, a communication of presence and recognition that needed no translation. Jacob explained that the bears had been coming more frequently lately, that something was building, though he didn't know what. He had felt it in the air, in the way the forest itself seemed more alive, more present. He wondered if it had something to do with the development planned for the other side of the woods, the shopping center that would destroy part of the forest, or if it was something else entirely, something beyond human understanding. The bears, he said, always knew things before humans did, felt the currents of change like salmon felt the pull of their spawning grounds. Their increased presence might be a warning or a blessing, or simply an intensification of the ancient connection between this place and their kind. As they stood there, other people began to arrive, drawn by something they couldn't name. First came an elderly woman who had been married in the chapel 50 years ago, saying she had felt called to visit today, though she didn't know why. Then a young couple who had been hiking in the woods and found themselves inexplicably drawn to the chapel. Soon there were a dozen people, all standing quietly, all watching the bears with the same wonder that Ethan and Jessica felt. Nobody spoke above a whisper. Nobody made sudden movements. Everyone understanding instinctively that they were part of something sacred, something that required reverence and respect. The bears seemed to acknowledge each new arrival, the patriarch lifting his massive head to regard each person as if taking their measure. The cubs played on, their joy infectious, making even the most skeptical observers smile. One cub, bolder than the others, ventured closer to the human gathering, stopping just at the invisible line that separated wild from civilized. A little girl in the crowd, no more than 5 years old, stepped forward, her mother reaching to pull her back but stopping when she saw the peace in the scene. The girl and the cub regarded each other for a long moment. Then the girl began to sing, a simple nursery rhyme about teddy bears having a picnic. The cub tilted its head, listening, and then, impossibly, seemed to dance a little, swaying to the rhythm of the child's song. This moment broke something open in the gathering. People began to share their own stories of encounters with the chapel's bears, stories they had never told anyone for fear of not being believed. A man described seeing a bear on his wedding day, how it had appeared just as he was having doubts, how its presence had somehow assured him he was making the right choice. A woman told of bringing her sick child to the chapel to pray, only to find a mother bear and cub already there, how her child's fever had broken that very night. Story after story emerged, weaving together into a narrative of connection and mystery that spanned generations and touched countless lives. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed specially designed for this moment, the bears began to move. Not away, but in a pattern. A slow dance that had the quality of ritual. The patriarch moved first, his bulk surprisingly graceful as he traced a large circle. The mother bears followed, each with their cubs, creating concentric circles that moved in opposite directions. It was beautiful and hypnotic, like watching the gears of some cosmic clock, and the humans found themselves swaying slightly, caught in the rhythm of something ancient and profound. Leo laughed in Jessica's arms, his joy pure and infectious. And one by one, the other children in the crowd began to laugh too, their voices mixing with the soft huffing sounds from the bears in a chorus that seemed to bridge two worlds. Jacob whispered that he had only seen this once before, when he was a young man, on the night his grandfather died. It was, he believed, a ceremony of transition, a marking of change, though whether that change was ending or beginning, he couldn't say. The dance continued as darkness began to fall. The bears' movements becoming more difficult to see, but somehow more felt, as if their presence was impressing itself not just on the eyes but on the soul. Fireflies began to emerge, adding their own light to the scene, dancing among the bears as if they too were part of this ancient ritual. The boundary between human and nature, between civilization and wild, seemed to dissolve in the growing darkness, leaving only connection, only unity. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the dance stopped. The bears stood still, all facing the chapel, and in that stillness was a weight of meaning that pressed against everyone present. The patriarch made a sound, low and long, that resonated in the chest like a church bell, like thunder, like the earth itself speaking. The other bears joined in, their voices creating a harmony that was both beautiful and slightly terrifying in its power. It wasn't a roar, wasn't aggression, but it was undeniably a statement, a declaration of something important, something that would be remembered by everyone who heard it. The sound seemed to go on forever, rising and falling like waves, like breath, like the heartbeat of the world itself. When the sound finally faded, the bears began to leave, but slowly, deliberately, each one passing close enough to the human gathering that their presence could be felt like heat from a fire. The mother with the marked cub came last, stopping directly in front of Ethan, Jessica, and Leo. She stood there for a long moment, her eyes meeting each of theirs in turn, and in those eyes was intelligence, understanding, and something that looked remarkably like gratitude. Then she turned and followed the others into the forest, her cub bouncing along beside her, occasionally looking back at Leo as if saying goodbye to a friend. The humans stood in silence long after the bears had gone, each processing what they had witnessed in their own way, each knowing that they had been part of something extraordinary. As people began to drift away, murmuring to each other in hushed tones, sharing contact information, promising to meet again, Ethan and Jessica remained with Jacob. He led them back into the chapel, to the room with the journals, and pulled out a new, empty book. He handed it to them with hands that trembled slightly, telling them that it was their turn now, their responsibility to document what was happening, to be the keepers of this continuing story. The chapel, he explained, chose its chroniclers, and it had chosen them through Leo, through their openness to wonder, through their willingness to see without fear. He was getting old, he said, and while he would continue to care for the chapel as long as he could, he needed to know that someone would carry on the tradition of bearing witness to the mystery. Jessica took the journal, feeling its weight as more than just paper and binding. It was a responsibility, a trust, a connection to something larger than themselves. She thought about the world Leo would grow up in, a world that often seemed disconnected from nature, from mystery, from wonder, and she understood that this journal, this responsibility, was also a gift. It was a way to ensure that her son would always remember that magic was real, that connections existed beyond what could be explained, that the world was full of bridges between realms if you only knew how to look for them. She opened the journal to the first page and began to write, describing their day, their encounter, the feelings that had no words but demanded to be captured anyway. As she wrote, Ethan explored more of the chapel, drawn to corners and spaces they hadn't yet examined. In the bell tower, accessed by a narrow, winding staircase, he found more evidence of the bear's long relationship with this place. Claw marks on the wooden beams that looked deliberate, almost like writing. Tufts of fur caught in places where bears shouldn't have been able to reach, suggesting they had been coming here for far longer than anyone had documented. And there, carved into a beam so old the wood had turned almost black, was the same marking the cub bore on its ear, carved with precision and purpose, like a signature, like a claim, like a promise. He called Jessica up to see, and together they stood in the bell tower as the last light faded from the sky, Leo quiet in his mother's arms, all three of them feeling the weight and wonder of what they had discovered. Below them, Jacob moved through the chapel, lighting candles for evening prayer, a ritual he performed whether anyone came or not, maintaining the sacred nature of the space. The candlelight flickered up through the gaps in the floorboards, creating patterns on the bell tower walls that seemed to dance and shift like living things. And in that light, they could see more carvings, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all variations of the same mark. A record of generations of bears who had claimed this place as theirs just as humans had. The sound came one more time from the forest, distant now, almost like an echo, and Leo responded with a sound of his own, a perfect imitation that should have been impossible for a baby to make. Jessica and Ethan looked at each other, understanding passing between them without words. Their son had been changed by this encounter, marked in his own way, connected to something that would shape his life in ways they couldn't yet imagine. They thought about the stories in the journals, about children who had encountered the bears and grown up to be healers, teachers, protectors of wild places. They wondered what Leo would become, what path this day had set him on, what role he would play in the continuing story of the chapel and its guardians. They descended from the bell tower to find Jacob had been joined by others. The elderly woman from earlier had returned with her husband, and they had brought photo albums from their wedding 50 years ago. In one photograph, barely visible in the background, was the unmistakable shape of a bear watching from the forest edge. The young couple had returned too, with a laptop showing satellite images of the area, pointing out patterns in the forest that suggested paths, gathering places, perhaps even dens, all centered around the chapel like spokes on a wheel. More people arrived, drawn by word of mouth, by feeling, by something indefinable that told them tonight was important. What emerged from the impromptu gathering was remarkable. Person after person shared not just stories of bear encounters, but stories of how those encounters had changed them. A man who had been planning to sell the forest land he had inherited until he saw the bears here and understood his land was part of their territory, part of something that shouldn't be broken. A woman who had been lost in grief after her child's death until she encountered a mother bear with cubs here and found a way to continue living. Story after story of healing, of connection, of moments when the veil between worlds had thinned and something essential had passed through. The chapel, they began to understand, wasn't just a building. It was a node, a meeting place, a thin spot where different kinds of consciousness could recognize each other. As midnight approached, Jacob suggested they hold a service, not a formal religious ceremony, but something more universal, a recognition of what they had all witnessed and been part of. They gathered in the main chapel, the candles creating a warm, flickering light that made shadows dance on the walls. Jacob spoke first, his voice carrying the authority of years spent as guardian of this threshold. He talked about the sacred nature of boundaries, how the most holy places were often where different worlds met, shore and sea, earth and sky, wild and tame. The chapel, he said, had been built on such a boundary, whether by design or providence, and it had become a place where the conversation between human and nature could continue, even as such conversations became rare in the modern world. Others spoke too, sharing what the day had meant to them, what they thought it might mean for the future. The young couple announced they were organizing a protection group for the forest, that the development plans had to be stopped, that this connection between the chapel and the bears was too precious to lose. The elderly woman offered to compile all the stories, all the journal entries into a book that could be shared, carefully, with those who would understand. A local teacher suggested bringing children to the chapel, not to see the bears necessarily, but to be in the space where such meetings were possible, to grow up knowing that wonder was real and accessible. Through it all, Leo slept peacefully in Jessica's arms, occasionally making small sounds that seemed to echo the bear's calls from earlier. Several people commented on how he seemed different from other babies, more aware, more connected, as if he had been born with one foot in each world. Jessica found herself thinking about the future, about the world Leo would inherit, and she felt both fear and hope. Fear that places like this were disappearing, that the connections were being severed, that soon there would be nowhere for bears and humans to meet in peace. But also hope, because she had seen how many people still hungered for this connection, how quickly they had gathered, how readily they had believed. As the service concluded and people began to leave, many promised to return, to be part of whatever was beginning here. Jacob gave several of them keys to the chapel, expanding the circle of guardians, ensuring that the space would be tended even after he was gone. He seemed lighter somehow, as if a burden he had carried alone for too long was finally being shared. He pulled Ethan aside and showed him something he hadn't shown the others, a map of other places like this, other thin spots where the bears came, where the old connections still held. There was a network, he explained, of people who knew, who watched, who protected these places. Now Ethan and Jessica were part of that network, connected not just to this chapel, but to something much larger. The drive home was quiet, Leo sleeping in his car seat, Ethan and Jessica lost in their own thoughts. The normal world seemed strange after what they had experienced, the familiar streets and houses like a dream they were returning to after being awake somewhere else. They knew they would come back to the chapel, that it would become part of their lives in ways they couldn't yet imagine. They knew too that Leo's life had been shaped by this day, that he would grow up knowing things other children didn't know, seeing things others couldn't see. It was a gift and a responsibility, a blessing and perhaps a burden, but it was theirs now, part of their family story. At home, as Jessica put Leo in his crib, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. On his ear, so faint it was barely visible, was a mark. Not quite like the cub's mark, but similar, as if the pattern had been translated into human form. She called Ethan to look, and together they stood over their sleeping son, wondering what it meant, what connection had been forged in that storage room that went beyond mere meeting. They thought about the stories of children marked by fairy folk in old tales, of humans chosen to bridge worlds, and they understood that their son had become part of something ancient and ongoing. That night, they dreamed the same dream, though they wouldn't know it until morning when they shared their experiences. In the dream, the forest had grown to encompass the whole world, and humans and animals moved together through the trees in perfect harmony. The chapel was there, but it was everywhere, not a building but a state of being, a way of seeing that recognized the sacred in every meeting, every connection. And Leo was there, grown into a man, standing at the boundary between worlds with the confidence of someone who belonged to both, helping others cross over, helping them see. The marked cub was there too, also grown, and they stood together like old friends, like partners in some great work that was both ending and beginning. They woke to find Leo standing in his crib, something he had never done before. Looking out the window toward the forest they couldn't see but knew was there. He was making the sound again, the one that had called to the cub, and from somewhere in the distance, carried on the morning wind, came an answer. It was faint, so faint it might have been imagination, but they both heard it, and they knew the connection hadn't been broken by distance or returned to normal life. It was permanent now, part of who they were, who Leo was, who they would all become. The ordinary world would continue. They would go to work, pay bills, live their lives, but underneath it all would be this knowledge, this connection, this responsibility to remember and protect and bear witness to the places where worlds met. Jessica picked up the journal Jacob had given them and continued writing, documenting not just what had happened, but what was continuing to happen. The subtle changes in Leo, the dreams, the sense of being part of something larger. She wrote about the fear that such places were disappearing, but also about the hope that people were ready to protect them, to remember them, to pass them on to the next generation. She wrote about the mark on Leo's ear, about what it might mean to be chosen as a bridge, about the responsibility of raising a child who would see more than others, know more than others, be called to more than others. As she wrote, Ethan researched, finding stories from around the world of similar connections, similar thin places where the ordinary and extraordinary met. He found scientific studies about the intelligence of bears, their ability to recognize individual humans, to pass on knowledge through generations, to mourn their dead and celebrate their young. He found indigenous stories about bear spirits, about humans who could speak with bears, about times when the boundary between species was more fluid. Everything he found reinforced what they had experienced, gave context to it, made it both more real and more mysterious. The world he was discovering was full of these connections, these bridges, but most people had forgotten how to see them. Days passed, then weeks, and life continued, but changed. They returned to the chapel regularly, sometimes finding evidence of recent bear visits, sometimes meeting other people who had been drawn there. Jacob taught them the history of the place, the rituals that had developed over the years, the ways to read the signs that the bears left. Leo grew rapidly, reaching milestones earlier than expected, always with that unusual awareness, that sense of being connected to something beyond the immediate world. The mark on his ear became more visible as he grew, and other children seemed drawn to him, as if recognizing something special, something different. The development threatening the forest became a rallying point for the community that had formed around the chapel. The young couple from that first night organized protests, petitions, legal challenges. The story of the bears and the chapel, carefully told, began to spread, drawing environmentalists, spiritual seekers, scientists interested in human-animal connections. The chapel became not just a local secret but a symbol of something larger, a reminder that there were still places where the old connections held, where mystery was alive and accessible. The developer eventually withdrew, citing community opposition, but also, privately, mentioning strange dreams, feelings of being watched in the forest, a growing certainty that some places weren't meant to be developed. On Leo's first birthday, they held the celebration at the chapel. It was a small gathering, just family and the close circle who knew about the bears, but as they sang happy birthday, as Leo smeared cake on his face with obvious joy, they heard it, the sound from the forest, the same low, resonant call that had marked their first encounter. This time, though, it sounded like celebration, like blessing, like welcome. Leo responded with his own call, clearer now, more confident, and from the forest edge, just visible in the afternoon light, the marked cub appeared, also a year older, also changed but still connected. The cub didn't come closer, but it didn't need to. The acknowledgement was enough, the reminder that the connection endured, that parallel lives were being lived, that the bridge between worlds remained strong. Other bears appeared briefly, the mother, the patriarch. Others they had come to recognize, all witnessing this human celebration as the humans had witnessed their rituals. It lasted only minutes, but those minutes contained eternity, contained promise, contained the assurance that some things endure despite the changing world, that some connections once made can never be broken. As the party continued, as normal life reasserted itself with presents and games and laughter, Jessica found herself thinking about time, about how this day would be remembered, would become story, would join all the other stories in the journals that documented this ongoing miracle. She thought about Leo growing up, about the friends he would make who would understand, about the ones who wouldn't, about the choices he would have to make about how much to reveal, how much to protect. She thought about the marked cub growing up too, facing its own challenges, its own choices, but always carrying that connection, that bridge to another world. The sun set on Leo's first birthday with unusual beauty, the sky turning colors that seemed impossible, that made everyone stop and watch. Jacob said it was the chapel's gift, its way of marking important moments, and whether that was true or just the romanticism of an old man who had spent his life in service to mystery. Everyone chose to believe it. As the last light faded and the first stars appeared, an owl called from the bell tower, another bridge between day and night, earth and sky, known and unknown. The sound seemed to release everyone from the spell of the day, and they began to pack up, to say goodbye, to return to their ordinary lives carrying something extraordinary within them. But Ethan, Jessica, and Leo stayed a while longer, sitting in the chapel as darkness fell completely, feeling the presence of the place, the weight of its history, the promise of its future. Leo was quiet, almost meditative, his small hand holding his mother's finger while his eyes stayed fixed on the storage room door, as if he could see through it to where everything had begun. They didn't need to speak. The silence said everything necessary. They were part of this now, woven into the story that had been telling itself for over a century, guardians of a secret that wasn't really secret. Just forgotten by most, overlooked by many, but kept alive by the few who still knew how to see. When they finally left, locking the chapel door behind them with the key Jacob had entrusted to them, they heard one last call from the forest, soft this time, almost like a lullaby. Leo was already asleep in his father's arms, but he smiled in his sleep, and his hand moved in a small wave, as if saying goodnight to friends only he could see. The drive home was peaceful, the ordinary world welcoming them back but no longer seeming separate from the extraordinary one they had just left. They were bridge people now, living in both worlds, responsible to both, blessed by both. That night, Jessica wrote in the journal again, trying to capture not just the events of the day but the feeling of it, the sense of standing at a threshold, of being part of something that was both ending and beginning. She wrote about her hopes for Leo, for the marked cub, for all the children and cubs who would grow up in a world where such connections were increasingly rare, but therefore increasingly precious. She wrote about the responsibility of keeping such places safe, such stories alive, such bridges open. And as she wrote, she could hear Ethan in Leo's room, singing him to sleep with a song that incorporated the bear's call, weaving it into a lullaby that would become part of their family tradition, part of how they would remember and honor this connection. The journal entry ended with a simple truth. We went to the chapel looking for history and found future. We went looking for my grandmother's story and found our son's. We went as visitors and left as guardians. The bears showed us that the world is still full of mystery, still capable of surprise, still interested in connection. Leo will grow up knowing this, believing this, protecting this. And maybe, if we're very lucky and very careful, his children will know it too, and the chapel will still stand, and the bears will still come, and the bridge between worlds will endure. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of forest, of wild places, of possibilities. Somewhere in the darkness, bears moved through their ancient paths, carrying their own stories, their own memories of the day when a human baby and a bear cub recognized each other as kin. The marking on the cub's ear caught moonlight as it moved, a sign and a signature, a promise and a responsibility, and miles away, in a suburban house that seemed ordinary from the outside, a baby slept with a similar mark on his ear, dreaming dreams that bridged worlds, that connected species, that remembered what most had forgotten, that we are all part of the same story, all walking toward the same mystery, all capable of recognition when we meet at the thin places where love is stronger than fear. The chapel stood empty in the darkness, but not alone. It was surrounded by the forest, by the history, by the promise of tomorrow's possibilities. The candles Jacob had lit earlier had burned down to nothing, but their light continued in other ways, in the memories of those who had been there, in the stories that would be told, in the connections that had been forged. The storage room where it all began was quiet, but it held the echo of that first meeting, that moment when Leo and the cub had seen each other and known, without words, without explanation, that they were part of something larger than themselves. And in the forest, the bears continued their ancient rounds, marking territory, teaching cubs, living their parallel lives with the knowledge that they were seen, remembered, honored by the humans who kept the chapel, who kept the stories, who kept the bridge between worlds open and strong. The patriarch, old and wise, stood at the edge of the clearing, looking toward the chapel, remembering his own first encounter there decades ago, knowing that the cycle continued, that the connection endured, that some things were stronger than the forces trying to separate wild from tame, mystery from mundane, sacred from ordinary. This was not an ending but a continuation, not a conclusion but a promise. The story that had begun in 1847 when a man followed bears through the forest and built a chapel where they led him was still being written, still being lived, still being discovered by those with eyes to see and hearts to believe. Leo would grow up to add his own chapters, as would the marked cub, as would all those who found their way to the chapel and discovered that the world was larger, stranger, more connected than they had ever imagined. The bridge between worlds would be tested, would sometimes seem to weaken, but it would endure because there would always be those who remembered, who watched, who protected the thin places where different kinds of consciousness could meet and recognize each other as family. The sound came one last time from the forest that night, so faint that only the most sensitive could hear it, but it was there, a call, a promise, a reminder that the wild was not gone, just waiting, not lost, just hidden, not separate, just requiring different eyes to see. And in response, though he was deep in sleep, Leo made a small sound of his own, maintaining the conversation, keeping the connection alive, ensuring that the bridge between worlds would endure for at least one more generation. The chapel, the bears, the humans who served as guardians, all were part of an ancient dance, a sacred relationship that predated the building, the town, perhaps even the forest itself. It was a dance of recognition, of respect, of remembering that we are all part of the same larger story, all walking through the same mystery, all capable of meeting at the edges where different worlds touch and discovering that the boundaries were never as solid as we thought. Kado's chapters of mentioned part has completed. The weeks following Leo's birthday brought subtle changes that rippled outward like stones thrown in still water. Jessica noticed it first in the way strangers reacted to Leo when they were out in public. People would stop mid-stride, their faces softening as if they'd remembered something precious they'd forgotten. Children especially seemed drawn to him, approaching with unusual calmness, their normally chaotic energy settling into something more focused, more present. At the grocery store, a little girl who'd been having a meltdown in the cereal aisle suddenly went quiet when she saw Leo, walking over to touch his hand gently before returning to her mother, peaceful and content. Her mother looked at Jessica with tears in her eyes, whispering that her daughter hadn't been calm like that in months. Ethan experienced the changes in different ways. His work as an architect had always been satisfying, but now he found himself drawn to different kinds of projects. Where once he might have designed efficient office buildings, he now found himself sketching structures that incorporated natural elements, that created spaces where inside and outside blurred, where the wild could coexist with the civilized. His colleagues noticed the shift, some dismissing it as impractical romanticism, others recognizing something profound in his new vision. One design, for a community center with a living roof and walls that opened completely to the surrounding forest, caught the attention of an environmental foundation. They wanted him to build it near the chapel, to create a space where the lessons of that sacred place could be shared more widely. Jacob's health had been declining, though he tried to hide it. His movements were slower, his breath shorter, but his eyes remained bright with the knowledge of secrets held and shared. He spent more time teaching Ethan and Jessica the subtleties of chapel keeping, the signs to watch for, the rituals that had developed over generations. He showed them how to read the scratches the bears left on certain trees, a form of communication he'd learned to interpret over the decades. This mark meant they'd been here recently, that one indicated cubs were present, another warned of danger from outside the forest. It was a language written in bark and claw, and Jacob was its last fluent reader, desperate to pass it on before it was lost. One evening, as autumn painted the forest in shades of fire, Jacob led them to a part of the chapel they'd never seen. Behind the altar, hidden by a tapestry that looked decorative but was actually a carefully designed concealment, was a narrow stairway leading down. The basement room it opened into was older than the chapel above, carved from stone rather than built from wood. The walls were covered in paintings, primitive but powerful, showing bears and humans in various configurations of meeting and partnership. Some images were clearly ancient, perhaps predating the chapel by centuries, suggesting that this had been a sacred site long before any building stood here. In the center of the room was a stone basin, worn smooth by countless hands, filled with clear water that seemed to come from somewhere deep underground. Jacob explained that this was the original spring that had drawn both bears and humans to this spot, the reason the chapel's founder had felt called to build here. The water, he said, had properties that science couldn't quite explain. It never froze, even in the deepest winter. It never grew stagnant, even though it had no visible source or outlet. And sometimes, if you looked into it at just the right moment, you could see things. Not the future exactly, but possibilities, connections, the threads that bound all living things together. Jessica leaned over the basin, Leo in her arms, and gasped at what she saw. It wasn't her reflection, or not just her reflection. She saw herself, but also her grandmother as a young woman, standing in the same spot, holding Jessica's mother as a baby. The generational connection was clear, a line of women stretching back and forward through time, all connected to this place, And there, alongside the human line, was another lineage: bears, mothers, and cubs, the marking visible on one in each generation, a parallel line of guardians maintaining the same sacred trust. The two lines didn't just run parallel, they intertwined, touched, influenced each other in ways that suggested the connection was far older and deeper than anyone had imagined. Leo reached toward the water with obvious interest, and when his finger touched the surface, the water responded in a way that defied physics. Instead of rippling outward, it seemed to ripple inward, creating patterns that looked almost like writing, like messages in a language that predated words. Jacob watched with wide eyes, saying he'd never seen the water respond like that to anyone, not even to himself after all his years of service. He believed it was confirmation of what he'd suspected since that first day. Leo wasn't just a witness to the connection between worlds. He was meant to be something more, perhaps a translator, a bridge builder in ways they couldn't yet understand. They began spending more time in the stone room, which Jacob called the heart room because he believed it was the heart of whatever power or presence made the chapel special. Jessica would bring her journal there to write, finding that her words flowed differently in that space, becoming more poetic, more truthful, more connected to something larger than her individual experience. Ethan would sketch there, his designs becoming increasingly organic, increasingly impossible by conventional standards, but somehow feeling more real than anything he'd drawn before. And Leo would simply be there, playing with toys that seemed to take on different qualities in that space, building towers that shouldn't have been able to stand but did, creating patterns that hurt to look at directly, but were beautiful in peripheral vision. During one of these sessions, they heard the bears above them, actually in the chapel rather than just near it. The sound of claws on wood was unmistakable, as was the huffing breath, the soft communication between what sounded like several animals. Jacob led them up carefully, motioning for absolute silence, and what they saw through the cracked door took their breath away. The bears had arranged themselves in the chapel in what was clearly a deliberate pattern. The patriarch at the altar, mothers with cubs in a semicircle, adolescents standing guard at the doors. It was a ceremony of some kind, though its purpose wasn't immediately clear. Then they saw her, the marked cub from their first encounter, now notably larger, approaching the altar with something in her mouth. She placed it carefully at the patriarch's feet, and even from their hiding spot they could see what it was, a human object, a child's toy, weathered and worn, but carefully carried. The patriarch examined it with surprising gentleness, then made a sound that the other bears echoed, a harmonious rumble that made the chapel windows vibrate slightly. It was, Jacob whispered, a ceremony of return. The bears had found something lost, something that mattered to humans, and they were returning it to the place where both worlds met. After the bears left, they examined the toy. It was a small wooden bear, carved with skill, but also with love, the kind of thing a parent might make for a child. On the bottom was carved a date, 1962, and initials, SM. Jacob recognized them immediately. Samuel Morrison, a boy who had gone missing in the forest that year, never found despite extensive searching. His parents had left town soon after, broken by grief, but not before leaving this carved bear at the chapel, a memorial to their lost son. The bears had found it, had kept it, and now, for reasons known only to them, had returned it. This discovery led to a search through the chapel's records, and what they found was staggering. Over the decades, the bears had returned dozens of objects, jewelry, books, toys, things that had been lost in the forest or left behind by people who never came back for them. Each return seemed timed to something significant, though the pattern wasn't always clear. sometimes the object would be returned just before a descendant of the original owner would visit the chapel. Sometimes it would appear when someone was grieving a similar loss. The bears, it seemed, were not just coexisting with humans, but actively participating in their stories, their losses, their needs for closure and connection. The toy bear's return had an unexpected consequence. Samuel Morrison, the boy who had disappeared in 1962, was found. Not his body, he was very much alive, living in a cabin deep in the forest, having survived all these years in a way that shouldn't have been possible. He was brought to the chapel, wild-eyed and barely verbal after decades of isolation, but when he saw the carved bear, he wept like the child he'd been when he'd lost it. Slowly, over days and weeks, his story emerged. He had gotten lost, had been found by bears, had been raised by them in a fashion that sounded impossible, but which he insisted was true. The marks on his body, the way he moved, the sounds he could make that the bears responded to, all of it supported his incredible claim. Samuel's return became a sensation, though Jacob and the others worked hard to control the narrative, to protect both Samuel and the bears from the wrong kind of attention. Scientists wanted to study him. Journalists wanted to interview him. But Samuel wanted only to sit in the chapel, to be near the forest, to maintain the connection that had kept him alive all those years. He couldn't fully return to human society. Too much time had passed, too much had changed. But he could serve as living proof of what everyone at the chapel had come to believe, that the boundary between human and wild was far more permeable than modern life suggested. Leo and Samuel developed an immediate bond, the baby and the man who'd been raised by bears recognizing something in each other. Samuel could make Leo laugh in ways no one else could, using sounds that were part human, part ursine. And Leo, in turn, seemed to calm Samuel's anxiety about being back among humans, his presence a bridge between the two worlds Samuel now straddled. Watching them together, Jessica understood that Leo's role might be even more complex than they'd imagined, not just a bridge between worlds, but a healer of those who'd been torn between them. The environmental foundation that had been interested in Ethan's community center design visited the chapel, and their reaction was immediate and profound. They didn't just want to fund the building, they wanted to create an entire preserve around the chapel, a protected space where the old connections could be maintained and studied with respect rather than exploitation. The development that had threatened the forest was not just stopped but reversed, the land purchased and added to what would become the Chapel Forest Preserve. It would be a new model, they said, for how humans and wildlife could coexist, how the sacred and scientific could work together. But not everyone was pleased with these developments. There were those in town who saw the bears as dangerous, who believed Samuel Morrison's story was either lies or madness, who thought the chapel should be closed and the forest cleared for safety. They organized, too, holding town meetings where they spoke of liability, of danger to children, of the need for clear boundaries between civilization and wilderness. The conflict grew heated, dividing the community in ways that hadn't been seen before. Some families who had been friends for generations stopped speaking to each other over the question of the bears and the chapel. During one particularly contentious town meeting, something extraordinary happened. The bears came to town. Not aggressively, not threateningly, but deliberately, walking down Main Street in the middle of the day with a dignity that stopped traffic and silenced arguments. The patriarch led them, his massive frame moving with surprising grace on the pavement. Behind him came the mothers with cubs, the adolescents, and finally, at the rear, the marked cub, now nearly fully grown. They walked directly to the town hall where the meeting was being held, arranged themselves in a semicircle outside, and simply sat. The meeting inside had gone silent, everyone pressed against the windows watching. Then, Samuel Morrison did something that would be talked about for generations. He walked outside, slowly, carefully, and sat down among the bears. Not next to them, but among them, accepted as part of their group. He began to speak, his voice rough from years of disuse but clear enough to be understood. He talked about his years in the forest, about how the bears had saved him, fed him, taught him to survive. He talked about their intelligence, their compassion, their complex social structures that in many ways mirrored human ones. He said they weren't animals in the way people thought of animals. They were a different kind of people, with their own language, their own culture, their own understanding of the sacred. As he spoke, Leo, who had been in Jessica's arms inside the building, began making his sounds, the ones that the bears responded to. The marked bear turned her head toward the window where the baby was visible and made a sound in return. It was a conversation, simple but real, and everyone watching could see it. The fear that had driven the opposition began to crack. How could you fear creatures that could communicate with a baby? How could you deny the intelligence in those eyes, the deliberateness of their actions, the clear intention to bridge rather than divide? The meeting ended without resolution, but something had shifted. The bears left as they had come, with dignity and purpose, and in their wake the town was different. Stories began to emerge from people who'd kept them secret for years, sightings, encounters, moments of connection they'd never shared for fear of ridicule. The chapel's journals were brought out and read publicly, the centuries of documentation suddenly carrying new weight. The town began to understand that they weren't dealing with a recent phenomenon but with something that had always been part of their history, hidden in plain sight. The preserve was established with surprising speed, the legal and financial obstacles melting away, as if the universe itself wanted it to happen. Ethan's community center was built at the edge of the preserve, a beautiful structure that seemed to grow from the landscape rather than impose upon it. The walls were indeed able to open completely, erasing the boundary between inside and outside. The roof was a living garden that attracted birds and butterflies, creating a vertical ecosystem that connected earth to sky. And at its heart was a meditation room with a glass floor looking down into a natural spring. Not the same as the one beneath the chapel, but connected to it underground, part of the same system that made this place special. The center became a gathering place for those interested in what was being called interspecies communication, though that clinical term never quite captured the magic of what actually happened there. Scientists came to study, but they had to agree to protocols that respected the bears' autonomy and intelligence. No tagging, no invasive observation, just patient watching and careful documentation of voluntary interactions. Artists came to be inspired, creating works that captured the essence of connection across difference. Children came on school trips, learning not just about bears but about the possibility of communication beyond words, understanding beyond explanation. Leo grew rapidly in this environment, his unusual abilities becoming more pronounced. By 18 months, he could make over a dozen distinct sounds that the bears responded to. What Samuel Morrison confirmed were actual words in what he called bear language, though he admitted that was a vast oversimplification of something that was as much about body language, scent, and energy as it was about sound. Leo could also sense when the bears were near, even when they couldn't be seen or heard, often pointing toward the forest moments before they appeared. His parents worried sometimes about how different he was from other children, but Jacob, in his increasingly rare moments of clarity, assured them that Leo was exactly what he was meant to be. Jacob's decline accelerated as winter approached. He had held on, he said, to see the preserve established, to know that the chapel and its mysteries would be protected. But his body was failing, and everyone knew his time was running short. He spent his last days in the heart room beneath the chapel, the ancient spring reflecting his face back younger and younger, as if showing him all the ages he had been in this sacred space. He told stories they'd never heard before, about bears that had come to him in dreams with messages, about times when the veil between worlds had been so thin he could step through it, about the responsibility and joy of being a guardian of mysteries. On his last night, the bears came. All of them. More than had ever been seen at once, surrounding the chapel in silent vigil. They stayed there through the night, their presence a comfort to those keeping watch with Jacob. Just before dawn, the patriarch made a sound unlike any they'd heard before, long and low and infinitely sad, but also somehow celebratory, like a funeral hymn and a wedding song combined. Jacob smiled when he heard it, whispered, "They're calling me home," and closed his eyes for the last time. At the moment of his passing, every bear stood on their hind legs, reaching toward the sky in a gesture so human, so full of grief and respect, that those watching wept not just for Jacob, but for the beauty of being witnessed in death by those who understood its sacred nature. The funeral was held in the chapel, of course, with the doors open so the forest could attend. And it did, not just the bears, though they were there at the forest edge, but everything. Birds filled the trees, deer stood in the clearing. Even a fox was seen watching from beneath the bushes. Samuel Morrison spoke, translating what he said were messages from the bears, memories of Jacob's kindness, his patience, his dedication to maintaining the bridge between worlds. Leo, now walking but still unsteady, toddled to the door during the service and made a sound that brought the marked bear forward. They touched hands to paw through the doorway, a moment captured in a photograph that would become iconic, representing everything the chapel stood for. After Jacob's death, the question of who would be the primary chapel keeper arose. The community that had formed around it was strong, but it needed a central figure, someone who could hold all the threads together. The choice, when it came, was obvious but still surprising. Samuel Morrison, the lost boy who had been found, the human who had lived as a bear, would be the new keeper. He understood both worlds in ways no one else could. He could read the signs the bears left, could speak their language, could serve as translator and bridge in ways even Jacob hadn't been able to. His appointment was confirmed in a ceremony where both humans and bears were present, the two communities acknowledging him as their shared guardian. Under Samuel's care, the chapel evolved. He instituted what he called sitting days, times when people could come and simply sit in the presence of the bears, not trying to communicate or understand, just sharing space. These sessions were profound in their simplicity and their effect. People reported healing from traumas they'd carried for years, insights into problems that had seemed unsolvable, a sense of connection to something larger that changed how they moved through the world. The bears seemed to know who needed them most, often approaching specific individuals, sitting near them, sometimes even touching them gently with a paw, leaving those people transformed in ways they struggled to articulate. The marked bear, now fully grown and magnificent, had cubs of her own that spring. One of them bore the mark, as expected, but something new happened. She brought all 3 cubs to the chapel and presented them to Leo, who was now 2 years old and increasingly verbal in both human and what everyone was calling bear language. It was a formal introduction, a presentation that suggested Leo wasn't just a friend but something more official, perhaps a godparent in the Ursine community, a recognized guardian of the new generation. The ceremony, for that's what it clearly was, lasted hours, with adult bears taking turns approaching Leo, touching him gently, making sounds that Samuel said were names, titles, recognitions of his role in their world. This event was documented by a team of ethologists who had been studying the chapel bears with appropriate respect and distance. Their findings were revolutionizing understanding of bear intelligence and social structures. But more than that, they were challenging fundamental assumptions about consciousness, communication, and the nature of intelligence itself. The chapel bears weren't just smart for animals. They demonstrated planning, cultural transmission, possibly even spiritual or philosophical thought. The marking that appeared in each generation wasn't random genetic variation, but seemed to be somehow chosen, designated, a sign of selection for a specific role that crossed species boundaries. The research attracted global attention, but the community was careful about how they managed it. Not everyone who came to see the bears was allowed to. There was a screening process, subtle but effective, run by people who had developed an intuition for who belonged and who didn't. Those who came with pure curiosity, with respect, with open hearts were welcomed. Those who came to exploit, to sensationalize, to prove their own theories, found the bears absent, the chapel closed, the forest impenetrable. It was as if the place itself could sense intention and responded accordingly. One researcher, Dr. Lily Morgan, came with a different purpose. She was studying what she called thin places around the world, locations where different realities seemed to overlap. She had documented similar sites in Ireland, Japan, Peru, and now she had come to the chapel. Her findings were remarkable. All these places shared certain characteristics: underground water sources with unusual properties, specific geological formations, and most surprisingly, historical records of interspecies communication, particularly with bears or bear-like creatures in the local mythology. She believed these sites were part of a global network, connected in ways science was only beginning to understand. Her research gave new context to what was happening at the chapel. It wasn't unique, just uniquely preserved and documented. Around the world, these connections were being lost, the thin places paved over, the guardian species driven away or extinct. The chapel was one of the last functioning nodes in what had once been a worldwide web of connection between human and more than human worlds. This knowledge brought both responsibility and urgency. They weren't just protecting a local treasure, but preserving something essential for the entire planet. A reminder of what was possible when humans remembered they were part of nature rather than separate from it. As Leo grew, his abilities evolved in unexpected ways. He began to draw before he could properly write, but his drawings weren't typical children's art. They showed things that hadn't happened yet, but then did. A bear with an injured paw that arrived seeking help the next day. A storm that would bring a specific tree down. A visitor who would come with important news. It wasn't exactly prophecy, more like he was tapped into the same network the bears seemed to access, the underground web of connection that linked all living things. His parents learned to pay attention to his drawings, to prepare for what they foretold. One drawing was particularly disturbing. It showed the chapel surrounded by fire, bears, and humans working together to fight it. And in the center the marked bear and Leo, older than he was now, standing in the heart room as water rose around them. Jessica and Ethan didn't know what to make of it, but Samuel studied it carefully and began preparations. He organized fire prevention measures, cleared brush, installed emergency water systems. He also began teaching Leo things a 3-year-old shouldn't need to know: how to find the heart room in darkness, how to open the hidden passages Jacob had shown them, how to call the bears in true emergency. The fire came that summer, started by lightning in a drought that had left the forest tinder dry. It moved faster than anyone expected, jumping fire breaks, defeating conventional firefighting methods. The evacuation order came, but Samuel refused to leave, and neither would Ethan and Jessica, not with the chapel at risk. What happened next would be debated and analyzed for years. The bears came. Dozens of them, more than anyone knew, lived in the forest. But they didn't flee the fire. They worked to fight it, using their massive bodies to knock down burning trees away from the chapel, digging trenches with their powerful claws, even carrying water in ways that seemed impossible. Leo, just 3 years old, stood in the chapel doorway, making sounds none of the humans had heard before, directing the bears like a conductor leading an orchestra. The marked bear stayed beside him, protective but also supportive, as if she knew he needed to do this, needed to step into whatever role he'd been born to fill. Together, human firefighters and bears fought the blaze through the night, and when dawn came, the chapel still stood, surrounded by a ring of burned forest, but untouched itself. The heart room had flooded during the fight, water rising from the spring in volumes that shouldn't have been possible, and that water had somehow spread underground, keeping the chapel's foundation wet and cool despite the inferno above. The fire's aftermath brought unexpected gifts. The burned areas regenerated with astonishing speed, and the new growth was different, more diverse, more resilient, somehow more alive than what had been before. Plants that hadn't been seen in the area for decades suddenly appeared. The water from the heart room spring, tested after the fire, showed properties it hadn't had before, or perhaps properties that had been dormant until activated by crisis. It accelerated healing, not just physical but emotional, psychological, even spiritual. People who drank it reported dreams that resolved old traumas, insights that changed their life paths, connections to loved ones living and dead that brought peace and purpose. The fire also revealed things hidden in the forest. Stone circles that had been covered by centuries of growth, cave paintings that suggested the bear's presence here went back millennia, and most remarkably, a second spring, connected to the heart room but emerging a mile away, creating what Samuel recognized as a sacred geometry, a pattern that appeared in spiritual sites worldwide. The bears had always known about it, had been protecting it, and now they had revealed it, trusting the humans to understand its significance and guard it appropriately. The marked bear's cubs grew quickly, and the one with the mark, a female like her mother, showed an unusual interest in Leo. They played together in ways that should have been dangerous, but never were, the young bear controlling her strength perfectly, Leo understanding her boundaries instinctively. Watching them, people began to imagine a future where such friendships were normal, where the boundary between human and wild was not a wall, but a membrane, permeable and flexible, allowing passage while maintaining necessary distinctions. That future seemed to be arriving faster than anyone expected. Children who visited the chapel began showing abilities similar to Leo's, though usually less pronounced. They could sense animals' emotions, sometimes communicate basic needs or warnings. Adults who spent significant time there reported changes too: enhanced intuition, deeper sleep with more meaningful dreams, a sense of connection that made them more compassionate, more creative, more alive. The chapel wasn't just preserving an old way of being, it was catalyzing a new one, or perhaps a very old one that humanity had forgotten but was now remembering. Dr. Morgan's research had attracted the attention of indigenous elders from various traditions, and they came to the chapel with recognition in their eyes. This was what their stories had always described, they said, the world as it was meant to be, where all beings could communicate, where the sacred was visible in the everyday, where humans took their place as part of the web rather than trying to stand outside it. They performed ceremonies that hadn't been done in generations, songs that the bears seemed to recognize, dances that made the very air shimmer with possibility. They said the chapel was a seed, and from it would grow a new understanding, a remembering that would spread like ripples on water. The ripples were indeed spreading. Other communities reported increased bear sightings, but not the dangerous kind that made headlines. These were peaceful encounters, bears appearing at the edges of towns, watching, waiting, as if testing whether the bridge built at the chapel could be built elsewhere. Some communities responded with fear, with attempts to drive the bears away, but others, inspired by the chapel's example, responded with curiosity, with respect, with attempts at communication. Slowly, carefully, other thin places were being recognized, protected, activated. Leo started school that fall, and it was a challenge. How do you educate a child who can communicate with bears, who draws the future, who understands things that most adults don't believe are real? His teachers, fortunately, were part of the chapel community and understood that Leo needed a different kind of education. They let him spend part of each day in the forest, learning from Samuel and the bears. They incorporated his abilities into the classroom, having him help other children develop their own latent sensitivities. They treated his difference not as a problem to be solved, but as a gift to be nurtured. The marked bear often waited at the forest edge during school hours, not interfering but present. A guardian watching over the child who had become so important to her kind. Other parents might have been frightened, but the chapel community had learned to see such protection as the blessing it was. The children certainly weren't afraid. They would wave to her, sometimes leave drawings for her, which she would examine carefully before carrying them into the forest. A relationship was developing between the human children and the bear cubs, mediated by Leo but increasingly independent, suggesting that his ability might not be unique but simply the first expression of something that many could develop. Winter came early that year, and with it came a crisis. The marked bear's mother, the one who had waited outside the chapel during that first encounter, was injured, badly. She had been hit by a vehicle on the new road that skirted the preserve, and while she had made it back to the forest, she was dying. The bears brought her to the chapel, carrying her somehow, and laid her in the snow outside the door. It was a request clear as any words. Help her, save her, use whatever magic this place possessed to keep her alive. But some wounds were beyond even the chapel's power to heal. What followed was not a healing but a vigil, a death watch that became a teaching. The bears showed the humans how they grieved, how they honored their dying, how they helped the spirit transition from one world to another. The matriarch was surrounded by her kind, each one touching her, making sounds that were clearly individual messages, memories, gratitudes. Leo sat with them, translating what he could for the humans, but much of it was beyond language, existing in a realm of pure emotion and connection. The dying bear looked at each mourner in turn, her eyes still bright with intelligence and what looked remarkably like love. She died at sunset, just as the last light was leaving the sky, and at the moment of her passing. Every bear stood and roared, not in anger, but in acknowledgement, in celebration of a life fully lived, in promise that she would be remembered. They carried her body into the forest for a burial. Humans weren't meant to witness, but they left something behind, a pile of stones arranged in the same pattern as the mark on the chosen cub's ears. It was a monument, a message, a bridge between the world of the living and whatever came after. The stones remained there, and people began leaving their own offerings, flowers, drawings, objects that represented their own losses and hopes. The matriarch's death changed the dynamic in the forest. The marked bear, still young by bear standards, became a leader earlier than expected. She had to navigate the complex social structure of the bear community while maintaining the connection to the humans, particularly to Leo. She did this with a grace that amazed the researchers. showing political skills that wouldn't have been out of place in human governance. She mediated disputes, organized cooperative efforts, and most remarkably began teaching other bears the communication methods she used with Leo, spreading the ability to bridge worlds throughout the Ursine community. Spring brought new cubs and new hope. The marked bear had her second litter, and this time 2 of the 3 cubs bore the mark. This had never been documented before, and it suggested an acceleration of something, an evolution or perhaps a revolution in how the bears related to the human world. The cubs were different from previous generations, more curious about humans, less fearful, more willing to approach and interact. It was as if each generation was born with more bridge-building capacity, as if the connection was becoming genetic, inheritable, permanent. Leo, now 4, had developed enough language skills to begin formally documenting his communications with the bears. With Jessica's help, he created a dictionary of sorts, matching sounds to meanings, gestures to concepts. It was rudimentary and incomplete, but it was a beginning, a Rosetta Stone for interspecies communication. Linguists studied it with fascination, finding patterns that suggested bear communication was indeed a language, with grammar, syntax, even what might be poetry, rhythmic vocalizations that served no practical purpose but seemed to give the bears pleasure. The community center Ethan had designed was thriving, hosting workshops, conferences, and gatherings that brought together people from around the world interested in what was being called the Chapel Model, a way of coexisting with wildlife that was based on communication and respect rather than separation and control. The building itself had become a teaching tool, demonstrating how human structures could integrate with rather than dominate natural spaces. Birds nested in the designed spaces in the walls. Small mammals lived in the garden roof, and occasionally a bear would wander through the open walls, examining the human activities with calm curiosity. One day, a delegation arrived from the United Nations Environmental Program. They had been monitoring the situation at the chapel, and they wanted to propose something unprecedented, designating the chapel and its surrounding forest as a World Heritage Site, but with a new classification, not just natural or cultural, but interspecies cultural heritage, recognizing it as a place where 2 species were creating something together that belonged to both and to neither exclusively. It would be the first such designation, setting a precedent for recognizing and protecting places where humans and other species had developed collaborative relationships. The proposal was controversial. Some argued it would bring too much attention, potentially destroying the very thing it meant to protect. Others saw it as essential recognition that could inspire similar protections elsewhere. The bears, when Samuel consulted them in his way, seemed indifferent to human political designations, but very interested in the practical protections it would provide. No development, no hunting, no interference with their movements and gatherings. In the end, the community voted to accept the designation, with strict provisions about access and observation to prevent the chapel from becoming a tourist attraction. The announcement of the World Heritage designation brought a wave of media attention that the community had to carefully manage. They chose to focus not on the spectacle of communicating with bears, but on the deeper message, that humans were not separate from nature but part of it, and that remembering this connection was essential for both human and planetary health. They shared the stories from the journals, the centuries of quiet coexistence, the proof that humans and wildlife could share space peacefully when both sides recognized the other's intelligence and right to exist. Not everyone was convinced. There were still those who saw the bears as dangerous wild animals, who believed the whole thing was elaborate deception or mass delusion. They pointed out, correctly, that bears elsewhere were not showing the same behaviors, that attacks still happened, that wild animals were not pets or friends. The chapel community didn't argue with these points. They simply maintained that what was happening at the chapel was specific to that place, those bears, that particular configuration of history, geology, and intention. It wasn't a model that could be simply replicated, but it was proof that such connections were possible. As Leo grew older, his role evolved. He was no longer just a bridge, but a teacher, helping other children develop their own abilities to sense and communicate with the more than human world. He was patient with those who struggled, encouraging with those who showed promise. He also began to show abilities that went beyond communication. He could find lost things by asking the forest where they were. He could predict weather changes days in advance by reading signs no one else could see. He could calm aggressive animals, not through dominance but through understanding, addressing whatever fear or pain was driving their behavior. These abilities attracted scientific interest, but Leo's parents were protective, limiting access and ensuring that any research was conducted with respect for Leo as a person, not just a subject. The studies that were done suggested that Leo's brain was indeed different, showing unusual patterns of activity, particularly in areas associated with empathy, pattern recognition, and what some researchers carefully called non-local consciousness. The ability to access information through means that current science couldn't explain. But Leo himself was uninterested in being studied. He just wanted to be with the bears, to continue learning their ways, to help maintain the bridge between worlds. The marked bear, now a mature adult with several litters of cubs, had become something like a queen in the bear community, though that human term didn't quite capture her role. She was a connector, a decision-maker, a keeper of traditions both old and new. She and Leo had developed a communication so sophisticated that they could have complex conversations about abstract concepts, justice, beauty, the nature of consciousness, the future of both their species. These conversations, when Leo translated them, revealed a depth of thought in the bears that continued to astound researchers and philosophers alike. One conversation in particular became famous when Leo shared it. The marked bear had asked him why humans made things that lasted longer than their lives: buildings, books, art. Leo had tried to explain about legacy, about wanting to leave something behind, about the fear of being forgotten. The bear had been quiet for a long time, then responded that bears left nothing behind but the forest itself, each generation nurturing it for the next, their legacy not separate objects but the continuation of life itself. She wondered if humans made permanent things because they had forgotten they were part of the permanent thing, the ongoing life of the world. The conversation had no conclusion, just a mutual recognition of different ways of being in time. As Leo's 5th birthday approached, he began having dreams that he insisted were not dreams but memories, though memories of things that hadn't happened yet. He saw the chapel standing centuries in the future, surrounded by a forest that had grown back thick and wild. He saw bears and humans living together in ways that seemed fantastical, but felt inevitable. He saw himself as an old man, still translating between worlds, surrounded by children who could all speak both languages. But he also saw challenges, times when the connection would be tested, when fear would threaten to sever what had been so carefully built. One dream was particularly vivid and troubling. He saw the marked bear, old and gray, bringing her last marked cub to him, also old, passing on some kind of responsibility or knowledge before both of them died on the same day, at the same moment, their connection so deep that one could not exist without the other. He woke from this dream crying, not from sadness but from the beauty of it, the rightness of it, the promise that the connection would endure even through death. When he told his mother about it, she wrote it in the journal. then held him close, understanding that her son was carrying something heavy and beautiful, a destiny that was both burden and gift. The summer of Leo's 5th year brought visitors from around the world for what was being called the First Interspecies Communication Conference. Scientists, philosophers, indigenous elders, artists, and activists gathered to share knowledge and explore the implications of what was happening at the chapel. The Bears, informed of the gathering through Samuel and Leo, chose to participate in their own way. Each day of the conference, they would appear at the forest edge at specific times, allowing observation, sometimes interacting with conference participants who approached with appropriate respect. The conference produced a declaration, carefully worded to be both scientifically accurate and spiritually meaningful. It stated that consciousness was not limited to humans, that communication between species was possible and had been occurring throughout history, and that protecting places where such communication happened was essential for the future of life on Earth. It called for a new approach to conservation, one that recognized other species not just as resources or even as beings with rights, but as partners in the ongoing creation of the world. The declaration was signed by representatives from 50 countries, though what difference it would make in practice remained to be seen. During the conference, something unexpected happened. Other animals began appearing. Deer, foxes, rabbits, even birds seemed to gather when the bears were present. It was as if the bears' willingness to bridge the gap with humans had given permission for other species to do the same. A deer walked right up to a conference participant and allowed itself to be touched. A fox sat beside a child for an entire afternoon, calm and present. Birds landed on outstretched hands without fear. It was as if the chapel's influence was spreading, the possibility of connection radiating outward like heat from a fire. This expansion of connection brought new challenges. How do you maintain boundaries when the boundaries are dissolving? How do you protect wildness when wild animals are choosing to be less wild? How do you prepare children for a world where they might be able to communicate with any living thing? The chapel community didn't have answers, only the commitment to navigate these questions with care, respect, and constant attention to the well-being of all involved, human and more than human alike. As autumn arrived, the marked bear did something unprecedented. She brought Leo into the forest, deeper than any human had been allowed to go, to a place the bears considered most sacred. It was a grove of ancient trees surrounding a spring similar to the one beneath the chapel. Here, she showed him, was where the bears brought their cubs to receive the mark. It wasn't random or genetic. It was chosen, bestowed through a ritual that involved the whole bear community. The mark appeared on cubs who were selected to be bridges, to carry the responsibility of connection across species. And now, she indicated, Leo was part of this tradition, not to receive the mark, but to witness it, to understand it, to carry the knowledge of it back to his kind. The ritual itself was beautiful and simple. The chosen cub was brought to the spring by its mother. Then each bear in the community would touch it gently, as if conferring a blessing. Then the matriarch, now the marked bear herself, would make a specific sound, a low humming that seemed to vibrate through the earth itself. The mark would appear gradually, like invisible ink becoming visible, not inflicted but revealed, as if it had always been there waiting to be seen. The cub would then drink from the spring and be welcomed into its role with sounds of celebration from the entire community. Leo was allowed to participate in the blessing, his small human hand touching the cub alongside the massive paws of the bears. When he made his own sound, trying to copy the matriarch's hum, something shifted in the grove. The trees seemed to lean in. The water in the spring began to glow faintly, and for a moment, everyone present, human and bear, could feel the network, the underground web of connection that linked all living things. It was overwhelming and beautiful, like seeing the face of the divine, and it left everyone changed. Leo most of all, who now carried not just the ability to communicate between worlds, but the deep knowledge of why such communication mattered.